My name is Joel, and in this episode of Unplugged I will be talking to Peter Hinssen, a remarkable man. He started out as an engineer, became a serial entrepreneur, and is now one of the most sought-after thought leaders on radical innovation, digitalization and leadership. He does keynotes all over the world and lectures at business schools such as London Business School and MIT. I met Peter earlier this year in San Francisco. Today we are going unplugged at one of my favorite hangouts in Amsterdam and discuss topics like his personal motives, the impact of artificial intelligence, and the future of humanity.
Cheers.
I think you have a pretty rich history when you look at what you've done in your life. So when you look back on your life and you would divide it in chapter headings, it can be 2 or 8 chapter headings, what would be the early chapter headings, what would be the middle chapters, and what would the current chapters be?
Well, I think the early chapter is nerd. I mean, I was a really nerdy kid. I didn't have a lot of friends. I spent most of my time with a computer locked in my room, and I had the big advantage that I was one of the first kids who really started to program on computers at an early age. So by the time I was 18, I was writing computer code to supplement, what I got from my parents as pocket money. But in those days, I was the kid with the Ataris and the Commodore 64s and the early Apple Macintoshes learning how to write code in Pascal or C. So that's nerd. I think I then had a chapter which was really entrepreneurial. And even as a kid, I dreamt of building a company. I didn't want to become a footballer, or I didn't want to become a policeman or a fireman. I wanted to be a software guy and build a company.
So what was that? Why was that?
I think because I was exposed to Apple early on, and I love the story of how 2 guys in a garage built a company that built really cool products. And I was inspired by Gates basically starting a company when he was only 18, 19 years old. And I think those stories really stuck to me, and I really wanted to do something like that. And I had the dumb luck that when I graduated, the World Wide Web exploded. And I finished my studies in 1993, and in 1994 I saw my first web browser, and in 1995 I started my first company, just when most people were starting to understand what the internet really was. And that second chapter was startups. I did a first startup that we grew to about 200 people in 4 years' time. We built software, and we sold it to Alcatel. Then I did a second startup which did streaming video, and we sold that to Belgacom, the KPN of the Netherlands, of Belgium. And then the third one was a company called Portus that was a cloud provider, software as a service, and we put it on the stock exchange. We IPO'd it in 2006, and we ran it as a public company. And I love that. But when we sold that company in 2010 to our Canadian competitor on the NASDAQ, that's a period of 20 years. And then I had a really big confrontation with my family because they said, you had 3 startups, we have 2 kids, and you spend more time on the 3 startups than on the 2 kids. Yeah. And it's true, if you're a startup entrepreneur, even when you're home, you're not home. And then I had a candid conversation with the family, and they said, why don't you do something else? And that's what I did. I mean, I switched gears, and I don't regret it, but it was really difficult because I think doing a startup is like, there isn't a day that doesn't go by when I wake up, I think, I think it's like a heroin junkie. Even if you're clean for 20 years, you wake up and think, damn, I'd like a shot right now. And I think it's the same with startups.
So how do you look back on that decision to quit with startups? Because it seems like it wasn't yours.
Well, I think in hindsight it was the right choice, because if I wouldn't have a family anymore. But it was hard because it's extremely addictive. And if you do one, you want to do another. And if you do another, you want to do one more. And I think it's something where now, if I look back, it was probably the best decision I've ever made, because my quality of life has improved. I spend a lot of time on the road, I travel constantly, but if I'm home, I'm home. And this is something that I really notice. And this is what my family tells me as well, is that if I'm home, I'm there. Because if you're a startup entrepreneur, you're constantly still engaged with your business, because your customer or your market or your developer or your investor, there's constantly something. And now, if I'm home, I'm home. So in that sense, it was a really good decision.
So what was the chapter after the startups?
I think it's more of a, it's probably reflection. I mean, I have a chance now to not be in the action, but to have a bigger perspective and to be able to reflect on the things that I see, to have some sort of a bird's eye view. I mean, if you're a startup, you focus on one thing. And now I have the chance to see many different technologies in many different markets and see how it's going to play out in many different companies. And that's been immensely rich, because I can be in a cookie company on Monday, and I can be in a bank on Tuesday, and I can be in a media company on Wednesday, and they all talk about how they're thinking about radical change. And I feel very privileged now these days to be able to see all that. I mean, in that sense, I'm an observer.
So that was the final chapter so far?
So far, yeah. I don't think it's the definitive chapter, you know, but being able to reflect and being able to synthesize and have a perspective and maybe a little bit of a long-term vision of where things are going, I find really rewarding. And part of it is, I also joined the London Business School a couple of years ago, and I've been teaching there for 6-7 years. And then last year I joined MIT in Boston, MIT Sloan, so the business school, to do very similar things. And it's wonderful. I mean, at MIT you're really close to the technology, but in the business school it's about what does it mean for the world, what does it mean for companies, what does it mean for society or for governments, and that's really rewarding to be able to do that.
Because what do you hope to bring to the world?
In a sense, I think one of the strange things that I see is that we're living through change that is tremendous. And I'm a collector of old IT, to give you an idea. And I have a collection, probably one of the biggest collections of old Apple computers in Europe. And if I exhibit that, and I show it to people, I have people who say, oh my God, I worked on that, or oh, I wrote my thesis on this. And then I asked them, what did you do with that? And they said, oh, we threw it away. Huh? And it's fascinating to see how, if you look at the phones we had in our lives that we threw away, the computers that we used to, it's almost unimaginable in this constant change that we're discarding a big piece of history. And in that sense, I begin to feel sometimes like a historian of change. Huh? I mean, I'm almost like a collector of radical change. And in that sense, yeah, maybe I begin to feel like somebody who is privileged enough to see. And then if you can boil that down and write that up into a book or put that into a lecture, or it's almost like time capsules of an era of fundamental change.
Your most recent book is called The Day After Tomorrow. What are you trying to achieve with the book?
Well, I meet a lot of companies that are trying to reinvent themselves. I mean, and the irony is that when I would do a lecture, say 10 years ago, and I talk about changes that is going to happen, and there would be 100 people in the room, there would be, I think, 5 people who would be uneasy and uncomfortable, and there would be 95 people who would go home and say, nice story, but no. And now we see that technology is accelerating the pace of change. It's changing society in so many ways. Many people have children that are the consumers of tomorrow, and they realize they don't watch TV, they don't watch the ads. If we want to reach them, what are we going to do? They have young people joining their company that is a fundamental different paradigm than the employees that are 30, 40, or 50 years old. Business models are changing overnight. And now if I do a lecture and there's 100 people, there's 95 people who go home thinking, oh, fuck, what are we going to do? And there's maybe 5 people who say, not for me. And that is an interesting thing. And what I'm really trying to find out is how can companies deal with that? And it's an era where you don't have time anymore to wait until the final Harvard Business Review article is written and you say, oh, we'll just do that and we're fine. No, you've got to do it and you've got to learn and experiment. And I think what I wanted to do with the book is figure out, one, to raise awareness that this day after tomorrow is coming and it's accelerating and we have to take it seriously. But two, to give examples of companies that I think are doing it in a really cool way, or that are trying it, and not wait until it's fully proven, but at least give some of the ingredients and the recipes of this is what you could do to actually be more fluid and more agile and figure out a way to be on top of that day after tomorrow. And that's just really cool to see.
So in the long term, do you believe there is a future for larger corporate companies? Why is not every company becoming a one-man company with a lot of freelancers you talk about in your book?
Well, in that sense, I haven't given up on large companies. I do think there is a big wake-up call in the sense that in the 20th century, being big was good because you had scale and power and muscle and finance. Now, it's actually a burden because in these times that are changing so fast, you have to be fluid and fast and rapid and adaptive. And being agile becomes the #1 priority. If you can't change fast enough, you're dead. And that's why big corporations have a disadvantage. But I haven't given up on the idea that they could do that. What I see is there are a lot of excuses why it can't happen. And I see a lot of big corporations say, oh, well, it's impossible here. No, it's, we have too much governance systems and the structures we have, and we have committees for this, but they're making up excuses. I believe there is absolutely no reason why a large corporation couldn't do that, and at the same time leverage the power. I mean, one of the really almost absurd things that you see is, I do a lot of work with startups, and I love startups, but you're small. And the most horrible thing about a startup is you're always starting from scratch. If you have to convince your first customer to buy in and you haven't sold anything yet, that's like an unsurmountable, hill to get over. You're always struggling in a startup. And every startup that I know wants to be big. And every big corporation wants to be small again. So I think there is this very strange thing that large corporations, if they would be able to be more fluid and then use their strength, power, scale, market, customer base, and money, I think they could do amazing things. And look at finance, for example. Banks, in the last couple of years, have gotten a little worried about fintech and all these fintech startups. You know what? I don't think that is their biggest threat. I think if one of the big banks figures out a way to turn their power base into a more agile power base, that bank is going to blow away all the other banks. So I don't think they should be afraid of the little, startup ants that are pecking away. But I think if you can figure out what to do, then you can become an absolute category king in almost every market.
Yeah. How do you look at the future of humanity? Because we have the day after tomorrow and we have the day after tomorrow. I think we're in a huge technological acceleration right now.
Yeah.
So in 10, 20 years from now, what's going to happen? In the scientific field is kind of divided about what artificial intelligence is going to do for us. You have optimists and pessimists. How do you look at that?
I'm essentially an optimist. But the older I get, the more pessimistic my view is on that. When I was writing the book, I had the chance to meet a couple of crazy people, and one of them was Nick Bostrom, and he runs the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford. This is a philosopher by training, but he has a team of mathematicians. I think he has like 10 or 15 mathematicians, and they've been calculating the strategies for humanity. So this is a guy who is looking like 50 to 100 years out and looking at artificial intelligence and machine learning and robots and automation and what are the chances that we as humans will survive. And after he did 10 years of research with all these mathematicians, and his conclusion in life is there is no chance that we as humans will survive. And I think this is a pretty sobering thought. I've been heavily influenced in the past couple of years by Kevin Kelly. He's the founder of Wired magazine. And when I was young, I wrote a couple of articles for Wired magazine, and he was my editor, chief editor. He's the founder of Wired, and I got to meet him a couple of times, and in my opinion, he's one of the chief thinkers on this subject. And he wrote a brilliant book called What Technology Wants. And his vision is that we humans seem to have this naive belief that we invented technology. And we're now thinking, oh, could technology kill us? But he said, technology isn't something that we invented. Technology is a vector. And when you see the evolution of life, we humans are like a very small fragment that is taking technology to the next level. And he said we should be grateful that we are at this moment the most intelligent species who has been given the task to take technology to the next level. So instead of fearing the fact that we're going to become obsolete, we should be thankful that we've had this position in the course of history. Now, that's maybe extreme. What I do think is we need to have a really societal debate about this. When Obama, in I think the last 2 weeks of his administration, he gave an interview in Wired magazine with the chief of MIT Media Lab. And he talked openly about AI and ML and jobs displacement, universal basic income. An American president talking about universal basic income is like communist heresy just a couple of years ago. And he basically said, we need to have a societal debate. Because if you look at the manufacturing jobs in the US, it's less than 10%. Trump was elected on the fact that these 10% people thought robots was going to destroy their jobs. But there's 70% of the US population which works in services, many of them in information services, in banks or insurance companies. And the impact there is going to be even higher. And basically Obama, in a brilliant interview, said, we're all fucked. We need to have a debate about this. And what I find cowardly about Obama is that he was president for 8 years. He's a real nerd. He really loves that stuff. For 8 years, he knew what was happening, and he didn't talk about it. And in the last 2 weeks, he said, well, good luck. Huh? And I think this is something that we have to do more intensely. I think we need to have that debate. I think we need to think about this, because the implications on how we live our lives, on many aspects that we now take for granted, I think we completely have to rethink.
In your book, you present a model which is about today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, and the shit of yesterday. Maybe you can elaborate a bit on that, and I'm curious, how do you use that model in your own life?
Well, I mean, the model really started in a very simple reflection on, in a world that's changing faster, we always look at tomorrow with the things that we know today, and we try to extrapolate. And I came up with this maybe naive idea that if you look at today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, today is the 112 emails we get on Monday morning we didn't know we had to worry about the Friday night before. Tomorrow, budgets. A lot of companies go through budget exercises, but they look at next year's budget basically as an extrapolation of today's budget. And then you have this day after tomorrow, new ideas, new concepts, new business models, new technologies, and that's where the real long-term value lives. And I see many companies spending too much time on today, a lot on tomorrow, almost nothing on the day after tomorrow. And my naive idea was, what if you would look at that day after tomorrow and calculate back, you would probably come up with a different tomorrow. Added to that, that you spend way too much time figuring out the shit of yesterday, which is dragging you down. The model is so stupid that it sticks in people's minds. And sometimes I have a fear that if I die, the only thing I will be remembered is, oh, it's the guy from the shit of yesterday. Honestly, it's what everybody who comes to a lecture, they remember the shit of yesterday. And maybe if it triggers people to think a little bit differently, fine. I mean, if it gets people to think a little bit more about the day after tomorrow, fine. When you ask the question what it means for me, I could give you a really cute answer. If you'd ask my family, they would probably burst out in laughter because they think I'm the most conservative guy that has ever lived. I could eat the same meal every single day because I just like to eat these things. My wife is the one who is always trying new things. my kids think I'm, the guy who's incredibly backward. I'll tell you a story. My 17-year-old daughter had to do some presentation at school where she had to say, what does she want to become when she grows up? And she was struggling with this, and she's quite assertive. And we were having breakfast, and she said, you know what? I'm going to say I want to be just like my dad. And at that moment you think, oh, wow. Whew. She said, if I see that you go around the world talking about the day after tomorrow and talking about new technologies and how little you know, it must be the easiest job in the world. That puts things in perspective. So yeah, I think maybe it's difficult to put that in perspective in terms of an individual. The only thing I would say is I'm insanely curious about that day after tomorrow. And I'd probably find looking at tomorrow just too boring. I just wish it was the day after tomorrow every single day. So I think that curiosity is probably what I try to maintain even if I get older.
So on a deeper level, do you want it to be the day after tomorrow, or are you able to be present as well? Because it's always today in the end. That's
true. And I think the only concern I have is that many of the things that I start to explore or write about or talk about is stuff that I'd really like to see. And I think that's the only regret I have I'm 48, so there are a couple of technologies that I'm really excited about, but that I know it's going to be a close call for me to see. And I'm not talking about AI, we're going to see that, or self-driving cars, we're going to see that, but the possibility to really fundamentally change who we are as human beings. The possibility to not just read our DNA, but code our DNA and rewrite our DNA. The possibility to build humans that have capabilities or intelligence or things we could have only read about in science fiction are going to become reality. And that's probably at the threshold that I won't be able to see anymore. So that's maybe the only regret I have in that respect.
So why does it excite you so much to really realize the potential of human beings when it comes to technology?
Because I really believe that in that Kevin Kelly philosophy, we are taking it to the next level. And I think I'd rather be the person who gets excited about the new than worries about maintaining the old. I don't think, when we had the Homo sapiens Neanderthals, people said, it's really sad that we're not going to have those Neanderthals anymore. No, you wanted to go ahead. And I think this is something where fundamentally people who really want to understand how to do things differently, better, in a completely new way, are the ones that I feel naturally attracted to. That's why I spend so much time with the startups, because those are the ones who don't know what they're doing and they want to do things differently. And I think this is, if you see Elon Musk landing a rocket on a barge in the middle of the sea, where thousands of NASA scientists for tens of years said, it's impossible, it can never be done, I get excited about those possibilities.
So it's all about becoming. That's what Kelly writes about as well, right?
Exactly. It's about becoming. And I think, there's a whole debate now about what it means, for example, in the world of artificial intelligence, right? And Kevin Kelly, I think, is right in the sense he says, we're always positioning like, okay, we went from monkeys to humans, and then we're going to have cyborgs taking over. He says, no, this is going to be a wealth of possibilities. And he compares, we always look at that from going up and up and up. But he said, if you look at the evolution of life, and he positions it as a sphere where we started out when we got the first cells to work together, and then it grew, but you've got fungi, and you've got ostriches, and you got hippos, and a squirrel is as evolved as we humans, but in different ways. And he tells a story which I really like. He says, if you take a squirrel can remember where he put 3,000 nuts 5 years ago to the exact location. And we humans think, why would you want to know where 3,000 nuts are all over the place? But for a squirrel, that's really important. And I think this is what we're going to have. We're going to have intelligence evolving in all sorts of directions. And I think what is really crucial is that point where we have to say, is it just going to make things more efficient? Or is it going to have the capability to really reinvent new things? And that's going to be, I think, a really pivotal moment in our human history where we say, okay, we've arrived.
At the end of your life, on your deathbed, when will you be looking back in a happy kind of way? What have you done for the world?
I think there would have to be an enormous amount of misery in the next couple of years to not reflect and think, I had a pretty good life. I mean, I think if you're part of an evolution, you should be privileged. If you were in 1825 in Britain and you witnessed the Industrial Revolution, I think you have lived incredibly full lives. You've seen change that was going to reshape the globe. If you were in France in 1789 and you saw the French Revolution and how we live our lives being impacted by that, I think you've lived an amazing life. If you were in Egypt when they built the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal and you were an engineer, I think you could only say, I have led an incredible life because I have seen changes that have impacted the world. We are all privileged at this moment to live in a time where we are the most privileged observers of one of the most fundamental changes in history. And I think we can only be glad for that. I would only be glad at the end of my life if I spent more time with the 1% who wants to believe than with the 99% whiners and people who think it's never going to happen. I'd be a happy man if I could spend most of my life with the 1%.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Yeah, great. This was really good stuff.
Really cool.